take you through what the purpose of the survey was, touch on some of the results and discussion of the findings and implications for the future. So that's what I wanted to do. What we wanted to investigate how ship handlers and pilots learn and consider the relevance of these skills today and in the future. Not strictly related to autonomous ship, but possibly. So when we learn, we do it in 3 steps. We learn how, we learn what, and then eventually we learn how, why we do things and how to do it. So it's a 3-step process. This is developed from community of practice theory by the initial research into this, who are Etienne and Wenger and Lave. I don't know if you've heard of them. And community practices are somewhat an abstract thing, but if you think about the master craftsman and his apprentice, such as a wheelwright from olden days, and you can move that forward today to other professions such as medicine, dentistry, teaching, and mariners. And COP is identified by a common domain, a collaborative learning technique, and as artifacts, repertoire, actions, and language. And virtual COPs are obviously a digital and online version of that. You could say it's as mundane as Facebook, but COPs are not normally moderated, but VCOPs probably would lend themselves to some degree of moderation.
Yeah, and the interesting thing when Richard started talking to me about this research is that community of practice resists external management. So it's very much can-do attitude of that. And mainly Richard has done the work, and I'm just sort of hanging on, getting credit. There was a survey. The problem with this kind of research is when you say pilot study, it doesn't actually mean it. So you made a pilot study.
I made an exploratory survey. It's probably best to differentiate between the two.
So this survey was exploratory, but before that you did a pilot exploratory.
Yeah, that's right. I did a pilot study.
Yeah. And they received 113 responses, and 61 of them were fully completed, but we analyzed, or actually Richard analyzed all of the responses because we think that data is valuable wherever, and all the answers that were there, even if it wasn't complete, would be valuable. So you could argue that that's not scientific, but we would argue back. The questions were designed to investigate several things, and if Richard had asked me before he sent the survey out, maybe there would have been fewer questions. It's the scope and effectiveness of learning methods and tools that are used by the people that you actually sent it to. It was the LinkedIn forums and the multiple organizations, so it's been a sort of a direct email to pilots and ship handlers. The causes of suboptimal maneuvers, not maybe to find out what was done wrong, but again find some clues to how people learn and what's going on when it doesn't work. The role of management and organizations in training, which is a little bit ironic because we resist management in communities.
Yeah. But I wanted to hear it from the practitioners.
Yeah. What good practice looks like as opposed to best practice. We think that there's many ways of doing something right. And a little bit of speculation, I suppose, into the future of ship handlers and the skills that they have. So the first question in the survey had 23 options provided, and they were identified by Richard in his LIP review and also from his experience. And they were tested to see if he had missed anything with their first pilot study. And the participants were then asked to mark how many of these apply to their own situation of learning, and also to rank them in order of effectiveness, which is the most effective way of learning ship handling. And then there was 3 ways analysis or categorization of these responses. The first was reducing them to 9 themes, which we'll show on a later slide. Another one is whether this training is made mainly ashore or afloat, or perhaps both. And then whether it was collaborative or self-managed. I mean, are you learning on your own or are you learning in a group setting? And I think that's where you take over.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So here's a pie chart of the 23 options reduced to the 9 themes. As Margarita said, I used my own background as a pilot to generate the 23 options, and they fell into these 9 categories, and I did it that way round. And so I put them together, as you can see at the bottom there. What I would say, this was the opening question, how people actually went about their business of learning. So this question, number 1, did it get 100% response? And the common with many surveys, the completion rate fell off after that. But this for me was the critical question, and this was answered by everybody. So I put them into these 9 themes, and if we take the reference materials, there's no differentiation between materials ashore or materials afloat, but typically reference material would possibly be video clips, books about ship handling and that sort of thing, so possibly done ashore within a maritime college setting. The simulators and models, there are such things as man models, which is a little boat that pilots and ship handlers can drive around on a lake, generally of about 1/80th scale. And simulators are, in the marine world, there's broadly two types of simulators. There's one for training the bridge team, which is focusing on the human side of things, and there's more specialist ship handling simulators. And I gave all participants the choice of both. And electronic would be what we call a PPU, portable pilot unit, and ECDIS and things like that. There's training value in looking at those and see how they work. OJT, on the job training, is basically the nuts and bolts of it. It's what people learn from collaborating and mentoring.
Just comment that many of these do overlap,
Yeah.
of course. This
Yeah.
collaboration, mentoring, and on the job training are very similar.
Yeah.
So, yes, so, and let's see, you do this.
Yeah. So categorising all the collaborative elements, that's 77% of all learning, which is a whopping statistic on how ship handlers and pilots believe they learn their trade. And the second point there was participants were asked whether they thought who had the greater role in their training, management or fellow colleagues and learner pilots, and the greatest score was for the role of practitioners is greater than management. And this comes back to one of the, you might say, flaws of community practice is an inherent pushback against authority and management. But that's across many disciplines. There's nothing unique to the marine world. But I'd say suggest that connecting those 2 responses indicates a very strong role of collaborative learning for ship handlers and pilots. I'll take it. Yeah. Suboptimal manoeuvre. Difficult for people to analyse their own mistakes and say, mea culpa. But suboptimal manoeuvre is not something which necessarily has resulted in a headline incident and an investigation by the investigation branch, but it might be something that didn't go quite as well, possibly took a little bit longer. So you had a plan, didn't go quite as planned, but not necessarily damage. And the main which came out of there is environmental conditions not as expected. Planning and loss of awareness featuring quite highly, but collaborative learning has room for improvement. So that comes bottom, which is almost like the community saying, we do a great job here. There's other people.
So it's a bit contradictory.
Yeah, it is, yeah. On the other option I got there, people spoke about lack of resources, lack of information, and lack of communication. And resources is beyond the pilot scope, lack of tow facilities, lack of communication, and a lot of that revolved around access to live meteorological data, which sometimes isn't what you might want or need.
Yeah, and coming back to this management and organizational role in training, I think this is a really interesting one. 62%, as you just mentioned, is about the collaboration. And what I sort of get the feeling, I'm thinking about these a little bit of secret guilds, and we're learning collaboration. We don't want anyone outside to know. It's kind of this
Dark arts.
dark arts, and you don't want to tell anyone how you
No,
actually pilot
no,
because somebody
no.
might take your job.
Yeah.
And there was a link still between this good practice regulation and industry, because there's a lot of comments about actually following regulations and obeying even, and following standards. So there is a connection, maybe
Yeah.
just not to the learning.
Yeah. So that was a lot of people felt that was the direct link, was following regulations, which again is counterintuitive to the way that COP sometimes can work, keeping all of that information to themselves. So, what does good practice look like? Everybody was asked the question. There was a good response on this. The word cloud was generated by software. It's actually put the second highest in the middle, competency. That was the second highest. The highest was actually seamanship, seamanship. But what the definition is of what is competency, what does that actually mean? And some people did expand on that and made a link with regulations and industry practice. But it's quite a sort of nefarious thing, is to put your finger on what actually is competency.
And the future.
Future. So, question not specifically asked in the context of maritime autonomous surface ships, but this is the response that came out quite strongly. 57% of the respondents not believing autonomy to be a threat. The view that technology is inadequate is possibly clouded by the fact that they don't know the full capability of what's out there. And knowledge of local area. We call it district knowledge, how the port's tides, currents, sort of a mental image of how the port works. You even sort of have an inbuilt sixth sense of traffic timing.
Again, I think there's a connection to that guilt thing.
Yeah.
This is my knowledge, my knowledge, and I should give it mental secrets of the trade.
Yeah. On that, if we rewind to virtual communities of practice, one reason why they don't work is because there's strong evidence that people don't want to put things out there, particularly in written form, and not necessarily social media, for fear of looking foolish. And there's another further strong evidence that they don't work without decent moderation, is that knowledge is power, and people who've got that knowledge like to keep it within themselves.
So it's true that pilots are kind of difficult.
You missed that. As I said to somebody at lunchtime, the basic premise I was told was work backwards from the barrister. But as I asked from the floor earlier, while we have autonomies, there are a number of different drivers I would suggest. And from the pilot ship handler's point of view, they believe it will reduce manning costs, which is obviously a big cost saving to ship operators and ship management companies. I've got one more, do we take it now? Yeah, some conclusions.
Now we need to talk about slide design. Contrast.
Text size, yeah.
No, contrast.
Yeah. So the community has all the hallmarks and attributes of a mature community of practice. But one thing that comes out is that there's a lot of skills out there which don't get cascaded and spread, and there's a big gap between the knowledge between what pilots may have and other ship handlers, as in ship's masters who do their own ship handling, which is perfectly possible and it happens every day of the year. And the community of pilots tends to keep that information close, and it is spread and cascaded. But if you think about ship masters for a very large shipping company, they may live in all corners of the globe, and the ability of them to come together and exchange ideas, tips, did you do that, what about that, is very, very limited. I mean, one thing I can tell you from experience is when there's 3 pilots and somebody says, oh, I did this, and it didn't go so well, the other 2 won't say a word. It's the fastest route to free experience you'll ever get. And there's a big gap on the third point there between the IMO resolution A960 is what drives pilot training, and it's only a sort of a document, 3-4 pages, nothing huge, and there's a lot of things not specified. It says we shall do bridge resource management. What that is, nobody says. We should have district knowledge. What that is, nobody says. And there's a big gap between that and then the legal requirements of STCW, which stands as a training certificate of watchkeeping, and that's the legal framework. I say not all pilots are STCW qualified, most are, but not all are. And I suggest at the bottom one that in a safety critical environment there's got to be more give and take between communities of practice and regulators and authorities to try and get the information flow better for today and in the future.
So does that mean that applying the theory of communities of practice is either you have to open up that concept or apply another theory if you want to allow regulation which is inherently resistant?
I think you accept it as a start point because that's how it works. But you need to look for another theory to encourage the flow of information